Welcome to Dollars and Cents, Creating Your Fulfilled Life with Nicole Romito from Private Vista. In this podcast, we draw from years of experience as well as guest specialists to help you create the life you imagine. Join us in this journey as we enlighten and empower you to align your lifestyle to help you achieve your goals with a clear picture of your future. Now, let's get to the show.
And welcome to the Dollars and Cents podcast, hosted by Nicole Romito. Nicole, good to be with you again. How are you?
I'm doing fantastic, Bill. Always a pleasure when I look at my calendar and see that we have some studio time on the books. So
yes,
I am ready
I feel the same way. I feel the same way. Who's the victim? I mean, who's your guest today?
Victim might be right. I think a lot of my colleagues feel that way when they are my esteemed guest. But in all seriousness, I have one of our senior advisors, Ben Audley, here in studio with me today. Hi, Ben. Welcome.
Hi, Nicole. Thanks for having me.
Appreciate you taking the time out. And Bill, what we're going to talk about, I think, I know you're going to be extremely interested, but I think it's going to be a really popular episode with all of our listeners. We're going to talk about, I love the title Ben came up with, the Vibe Session.
Oh, okay.
Right?
Vibe is the word for 2025, apparently. So, yes.
All right. So, yeah. And you might say, vibe could be maybe a couple different interpretations. But the way Ben and I are going to talk about it today is from what we see is there's a big disconnect between when we talk to clients or, people like friends, family, just individuals, a big disconnect between how they're feeling and what the economic data is showing about, the economy, the markets, the world, and things like that. So that's what Ben and I are going to take a little bit of a deep dive into today.
Excellent. Let's get started.
All right. So before we do that, for our listeners, since this is Ben's first time being on our podcast, hopefully not the last, so you know a little bit about him. As I mentioned, he is one of our senior advisors here at Private Vista. He is also a certified financial planner, as all of our advisors are. And he is just coming up on his 7th year of being in our industry. He graduated from the University of Wisconsin with a degree in economics and international studies. And his newest educational endeavor this year is he is an MBA candidate at Northwestern Kellogg School of Management. We were lucky enough to have him join our team back in 2021. And I think our longtime listeners know all of us are very passionate about helping our clients achieve their goals, both on a personal and financial level. Ben, when you are not helping our clients at Private Vista, do you want to share a little bit about what you and your lovely wife, Jess, like to do?
Yeah, so we have 2 little dogs and we love hanging out with them, spending time with them, taking them to new parks and to the lake, exploring Wisconsin too. We love to head up there whenever we can. We love reality television. That's one thing that she always loved, and I've come to love
it.
Yeah, that's right. Whether I wanted to or not.
Exactly. That was probably a good one to compromise on.
Yes, that's right. We take dance lessons as well, which we find that gets us out of our comfort zone, out of the day-to-day routine of life. So that's a lot of fun. And we love to cook. That's another thing that Jess really taught me was the joy of cooking and learning about different cultures through cuisine. So we have a lot of fun.
Oh, that's fantastic. Well, you guys certainly keep busy, it sounds like.
That's right.
All right. Well, thanks for sharing a little bit about what you like to do outside of Private Vista. Let's jump in. As I mentioned, our whole theme today is kind of the vibe session. And why don't do you want to kind of go ahead and start out? Did you want to add anything of how I framed how we're looking at vibe session?
Yeah, sure. Really what we'll be talking about today is the post-pandemic trend of American economic strength and how that has diverged with Americans' feelings or vibes, as you put it, Nicole, surrounding the economy.
Right.
The good news is Americans generally feel good about their personal finances. The bad news is they generally feel terrible about the national economy. And we'll dive into the large divergence and potential reasoning behind that. This is a good time to pause and say that the situation is very fluid.
Yes.
We're looking at data over the past couple of years here. President-elect Trump has certainly wasted no time leaving his mark on the American economy, and certainly the full impacts of that remain to be seen. So certainly we want to make it clear that we're looking at the past couple of years and not trying to predict where things will go from here. This is not a political take, but we thought it would be a good time to take a look at how the economy has done based on the data that we're looking at, and try to understand really what's going on.
Yeah, I agree. And I just want to kind of build on your comment of this is not a political take, because I know when we are talking with clients, we have clients who support, both sides of the aisles, if you will, or different candidates. But one thing that I know we all talk about with our clients is it really, as much as you can, and it's hard because we're all humans, it is trying to separate the how you feel emotionally about, compared to what the data or the numbers are showing. And also too, because when we look at it, whether it's the economy or the markets, I know I'll tell clients this might sound a little callous or a little cold, but neither of those entities, if you will, are looking at, a person's value system or beliefs or things like that. It purely is more from a financial sense. So I think kind of just wanted to tag that on before we get started here, because it's hard. I won't put words in your mouth. I know sometimes I even struggle, but we got to look at it from kind of a, pun intended, dollars and cents, which is the name of our podcast, versus how you might feel personally about some of the policies or approaches.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah. So I think with that, then why don't we kind of go in, I'm not sure if you want to start with the economy, and we kind of, want to give some data points. And like you said, kind of the divergence of how people are feeling versus what is actually happening.
Definitely. Yeah. And before we go there really quickly, I don't want to take credit for the term vibe session. That was coined by a financial commentator named Kyla Scanlon back in 2022. So we'll be referencing her work, as well as another financial writer, Ben Carlson, throughout our talk today.
Great.
But getting back to the economic data, when we looked at exit poll data from NBC News from the 2024 presidential election, nearly 45% of voters reported being financially worse off compared to 4 years ago, which is the highest rate that we've seen since 2008 in an exit poll. Despite that, national economic indicators suggest a thriving economy. Inflation, although still challenging for consumers, has significantly slowed down. While there are some cautionary signs in the job market, overall conditions remain robust. And a recent Wall Street Journal survey of economists puts the probability of recession in the next 12 months at 25%, which is down from 60% just a couple of years ago. One of the main references we'll be discussing today was an article from The Economist, which is a UK-based newspaper published back in October, which was titled "The Envy of the World," referencing the American economy. And really, they did a really good job of laying out just how the American economy has become the envy of the rest of the world. And so I think what's surprising to us is, reading that article, you really wouldn't think that the American economy is the envy of the world if you asked Joe or Jill Schmo on the street, because popular sentiment in the country and commentary in the news and on social media especially has been that, America's not thriving economically and, maybe even falling apart. And we certainly aren't seeing that. So when we dive into the data, as we compare American purchasing power as a percentage of the group of seven, which is a forum of the seven of the world's biggest and most developed economies, including France, the US, the UK, Germany, Japan, Italy, and Canada, and the EU as well. The United States has steadily increased its purchasing power as a percentage of that advanced group over time. And it's now responsible for over 50% of the economic growth of the group of seven, which is pretty stark and continues a strong trend over time. The Washington Post actually put together a great chart that looks at real GDP growth, which is gross domestic product, or the total value of goods and services produced in a given period, adjusted for inflation. When you look at real GDP growth within that advanced group of seven countries in the EU, from the end of 2019 to mid-2024, the United States GDP growth has more than doubled the European Union, Japan, the UK, and Germany, and nearly doubled Canada's growth over that time period as well.
That's a big number. And I would add for our listeners that, GDP growth is really Ben, myself, all of us as individuals. So the individual consumer accounts for a little over 2/3 of that GDP number. So maybe, Ben, do you want to add some color on, I know you mentioned a little bit about wage growth, but what is causing, if the consumers themselves feel, I think it kind of leads back to one of your lead observations, which the consumer feels good about their personal situation, but not so great about when they look at the US or a lot of times even the world as a whole.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. If GDP growth is strong and consumer, consumption is 2/3 of that figure, clearly consumers are doing very well. And part of that too comes from labor productivity. How productive are American workers? When we look back and compare to that same group of G7 that we talked about, the United States has consistently outpaced our peers. And our labor productivity has increased over time to the point where we're significantly higher in terms of labor productivity per hour worked than the European Union, Britain, and Japan.
Interesting. Would you say that is probably, have we adapted technology at either a faster or better or more productive rate than the other countries?
Yeah, I'd have to imagine that's the case, certainly. And most of the world's leading tech companies are founded and thrive in the United States. So certainly that's playing a big role here. That's a great point.
Yeah. And I think too, just to kind of add on, because I know, right, you and I both, and we continue, right, it's AI, and the robots are coming for our jobs and things like that. And while there certainly will be some jobs that could be replaced by robots. You're seeing it. You go into a McDonald's or other fast food place and you put your order in at a kiosk. So you're now the order taker, if you will. Or I know they are even experimenting with like robots doing on the fryers and stuff. Mm-hmm. So there'll be some jobs where potentially, yes, machines could totally take over. But at least from my perspective, I don't think we're going into like and I'm probably going to quote it wrong, like a 1984 or right.
Yeah, and even in our industry, as we've been working to incorporate artificial intelligence into our practice, theoretically, it could make us 30% more efficient. So
exactly,
I think to your point, Nicole, we see it as more of something that makes us more productive. As we see in the continued trends, rather than something that'll replace human workers over time. At least that's the hope.
Yeah, exactly. That is where we stand today.
Another big topic of debate in this country over time has been energy independence. For a large part of the 20th century, we could not claim energy independence because we were consuming more than we were producing. But in fact, in recent years, since around 2022, we've actually been producing more energy than we consume. So that's been another very positive trend here in the United States, especially as gas impacts the majority of Americans in terms of their household costs. And then just shifting, more macro level, another barometer of how strong our economy is when you look at financial markets. And that's more specifically what we do in our day-to-day jobs. When you look at U.S. listed companies they account for more than 50% of the global stock market's value as of the end of 2024, whereas Europe, mainland China, and Hong Kong combined made up only 25% of the global stock market. So again, these are just a couple of the indicators that the economist referenced, but they really demonstrate the strength of the American economy.
Like you said, half of about 50% of the global stock market, if you will, is with companies that are headquartered in the U.S. But if you put it on the flip side, then 50% are not, right? So just like all things in life have their cycle and they're going to ebb and flow, there might be, and there's a lot of talk out there, I think the term, right, being bandied about is U.S. exceptionalism. And is that going to continue into 2025? Looking at it from the market opportunity for this part of the conversation. And I've heard people both, argue for and against that. But I know here at Private Vista, while we might tilt towards U.S. Companies on the stock side of our portfolios, there are still opportunities outside of the U.S. borders. And I know one thing we talk about on our committee is, you look at a company like a Home Depot or a Coca-Cola, they're headquartered in the U.S. But when you look at where they're expecting to get their growth or new sales or things like that, more often than not, it's actually outside of our borders. So I think it's just a couple different lenses to look through it, right? Really, what is a U.S. or non-U.S. company or what are you investing in? And then I would say, we don't want to, you can't just say like broad brush, let's do all US and no Europe or no outside, because within that, there are countries that are doing well, or even if a country maybe isn't in a good part of their economic cycle, there could be companies that are really hitting it and they're in their like best part of the cycle for their business and profits.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think it speaks to our conversation a little bit earlier about the strength of tech companies, especially in the United States. You look at the so-called Magnificent Seven stocks in the United States, which drive the stock market. By and large, those are tech companies that, have originated in the United States, expanded globally, and have become essentially global companies. And so it's interesting as you think about the conversation between made in America and sort of these global conversations that we're having these days. A lot of these companies are global, even though they are headquartered in the United States.
Right. And I know since the pandemic, right, before the pandemic, it was manufacturers, companies that sold, physical goods. A lot of them, they were either sourcing parts or the majority of it was being built outside the US or even outside in North America. Go back to 2021, certainly we had that supply chain headache where you couldn't get your parts and things like that. So a lot of people have, I know the term is like nearshored or friendshored, but it's still, while a lot of it maybe came back to North America, it didn't come back all to the US. So that's going to be, I think, an interesting trend to see how that ends up panning out, certainly with the current administration. And we know over the last week or so where tariffs are actually going into effect, no longer just a campaign trail talking point or a negotiating tactic, but some of them have actually gone into effect.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see where that goes from here. We saw some negotiation with Mexico and Canada,
right?
And tariffs were put on pause. I think one of the biggest questions as we look forward rather than backward is how much of Trump's campaign agenda will be put into effect. How much is just negotiation?
Right.
How much is he actually intentional about implementing? So that'll be certainly something to keep an eye on. And, as we discuss global interactions going forward.
I mean, it's probably changed 4 times since we've been recording our episode here, Ben.
Yeah, even as of yesterday, as of recording, there are new tariffs on steel and aluminum imports. So
correct.
it remains to be seen how that'll play out.
Yeah, absolutely. And certainly, I think he talks about them a little more, makes them more of a central talking point, but he's certainly not the first president to, put tariffs into effect. And some of the ones he put into effect with his first administration, the Biden administration stayed in place. So I agree with you. I think it is unfortunately, because I think as humans, we don't like to be in limbo, but we really are at you have to wait and see.
Mm-hmm. Certainly. And we can circle back to the tariff conversation later on too.
Perfect. All right. So I think, did you maybe want to talk, if we kind of go back to maybe another disconnect, did you want to maybe hit upon wages?
Yeah. I think one of the biggest detractors to the narrative that the U.S. economy is doing well is a concept that I'm sure our listeners are sick of hearing about by now, and that's inflation.
Yes.
And certainly not without good reason that inflation has been a massive talking point because, post-COVID-19 pandemic, inflation reached levels we hadn't seen in several decades, and many consumers felt that pain at the grocery store, when filling up cars at the gas station, and pretty much, across the board. We saw massive price increases. However, what's surprising is since February 2020, wages have actually grown faster than inflation for most Americans, from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, meaning that wage earners in this country have actually experienced a net increase to their income even after inflation, over the past couple of years, which is certainly something that you don't hear on the news every day.
No, I would just say probably you don't hear on the news, period, right?
Right. And we'll talk more about that, why we don't hear about that a little bit later. That'll
be a good one to kind of wrap all this up, if you will. So,
sure.
Because it is a really good point.
And something else that's been surprising post-pandemic has been the success of not just the upper echelons of wealth in the U.S., but also the growth in wealth across the spectrum of net worth in this country. According to the Washington Post, since the end of 2019, in terms of net worth, the bottom 50% of Americans have seen their wealth nearly double, far outpacing other tiers of wealth over that time period. So, really, when we talk about the economy doing well, this is not just a story of economic prosperity for the 1%. Again, we don't want to claim that the economy has been great for everybody. We know some people have been left behind.
Right.
But, hearing that the bottom 50% of Americans by net worth in this country have seen their wealth double over the past couple of years, that's likely to shock some people.
Yeah, I would agree. I know I was surprised when I saw this chart. And for our listeners, we will have some links to some of the charts that Ben is highlighting in the show notes of the episode. But do you know, Ben, and I don't want to put you on the spot, so if it's okay if you don't, but do you know what was the cause? What was the driver for that increase to the bottom half? I'm trying to think, is it home equity? Because I know we've seen, that go up, or is it, because bottom 50, you don't generally think maybe having access to 401ks and things like that. Do you have any details you can share?
I think coming out of the pandemic, the three industries that were hiring and paying the most were, I think it was healthcare, hospitality, and restaurants. And so
Makes
when
sense.
you think about who gets hired generally in those three industries, you're typically looking at, relative to, say, tech companies or Wall Street, lower wage paying positions. And I think this largely contributed to that. You heard stories about McDonald's workers having a higher hourly rate than paramedics. Again, I'd have to fact check whether that's still true to this day, but we certainly heard stories like that coming out of the pandemic. I also think you hit on two other key points, which may be at play here, which is that low interest rates.
Right.
People that were fortunate enough to put a down payment on a home and purchase a home, they have very low mortgage interest rates, and certainly the housing market and prices since post-pandemic have appreciated significantly. So that's contributed to net worth increases. And then also, I think, as you mentioned, 401ks the stock market has done very well, up over 20% the past 2 years.
Right.
Had a strong year coming out of COVID as well. So certainly I think those are large contributors to net worth. It's one thing to have an elevated net worth, but it's another thing to feel wealthy. So if a lot of your net worth is coming from appreciated home values or appreciated 401k values, if you're not accessing those sources of net worth, that could be a reason why people don't feel like their wealth has increased, even though it has on paper.
Yeah, I would agree. And especially, with rates, they came down a little bit towards the end of the last year, but 30-year traditional mortgages have been anywhere from about 6.5% to 7% recently. So to your point, if a lot of your wealth is tied up in equity in your home, you really can't unlock it, and you might not be able to move because of if your interest rate now is twice as much, that's going to have a real impact on your monthly payment and what you can afford to carry. So I think that's a really good point, is on paper, you say, I have all this equity in my house, but I can't really do anything with it.
Mm-hmm. And that's actually a great segue to one of the other charts we were going to reference here, which is household debt to disposable income ratios.
Mm-hmm.
You may not feel wealthy, but when we compare Americans to Canadians and Australians, our household debt to disposable income ratio is much stronger than theirs are. For example, our debt to income ratio on average is less than 100%, meaning on average, the amount of loans or total debt that you have is less than your income. Whereas when you look at Canada and Australia, their debt ratios are close to 200% of income,
Wow.
meaning that debt is actually twice as much as their income. So,
right.
Again, when you compare the United States to our peers globally, once again, things look really good for Americans.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Okay. I feel like the hot topic of the week here is eggs. I didn't know if you wanted to hit on that at all.
We got to talk eggs. Yep, we have to. This is a podcast.
I do have to tell you before you go into, so I order mine from a small farm in Michigan, and they'll deliver them. And so they're literally like picked from the chicken that morning. And I tell you, I think I pay $6 a dozen, and I feel like pretty good about that because they're super fresh, and I'm supporting a small business owner.
That's right. That's right.
I know that is not the egg headline you were going to hit on. So I just I wanted to share with our listeners my inside egg tip. So
that's a great tip. Quick caveat here is I know that egg prices more recently have skyrocketed a bit, thanks to the bird flu.
Right.
But,
yeah.
Setting that aside momentarily, probably the most shocking statistic we discussed today, again, is going to come from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which looked at how many hours of work is required to afford a week's worth of groceries. And they plotted that on a chart over time from 1980 through 2024. And really what we've seen was pretty surprising. There's been a steady decline in the cost of groceries relative to wages over time. And although we saw a jump in these costs during the pandemic, specifically with eggs and milk, et cetera, when we talked about wage gains, those wage gains post-pandemic have caused the cost of groceries relative to wages to return down to pre-pandemic levels. And so, it's pretty shocking to look at this chart because groceries now are cheaper than they were in 1980, 1990, 2000, 2010, and even 2015. So certainly not something that I would imagine the majority of Americans would agree with if you were to ask them that question without showing them this chart. So, I think with inflation, we saw such sticker shock when we went to the grocery store and we saw the price of a carton of eggs.
Right.
That we tend to forget that our wages have risen faster in general than the price of groceries as a whole. And so therefore the eggs are actually cheaper than they were in the past. Again, nobody's thinking about, wage growth when they go to the grocery store to buy their groceries, but it helps put things into perspective here and pretty surprising when you do.
Absolutely. And I think that's a really, I think a good segue from that one is, we had the recession drum beating when the Fed was at the beginning of their rate tightening, or when they were consistently increasing interest rates. And all the talking heads or the economists or whoever you watch on TV, they were all giving a very high probability that we were going to have a recession. As you mentioned, the Fed did stick the inevitable, or I'm sorry, they did stick their soft landing, at this point. So do you want to kind of share with our listeners kind of what a soft landing is? And then, what potentially, from what you're seeing from these studies, what I think you said, maybe a 25% chance of recession, but is that a deep one? Or if you could give maybe a little bit color on that opening remark.
Sure. So it's the Federal Reserve's job to keep inflation in check. And so the main way they do that is by raising short-term interest rates, or the rates that they charge banks for short-term loans. And so what they did was, when we had inflation spiking coming out of COVID, they raised interest rates. And generally what happens is 3 out of every 4 times the Federal Reserve raises interest rates, they end up pushing us into a recession. And so when we talk about a so-called soft landing, because we were able to avoid a recession over these past couple of years, which is, sort of that 1 out of 4 scenario as we laid out, we were able to engineer a soft landing where the Fed raised interest rates, but we avoided a recession. And so far, looking forward, economists are projecting about a 25% probability of recession in the next year. Whereas a couple of years ago, when we were in the rising interest rate environment back in 2023 and the end of 2022, you had a near consensus among economists that we would have a recession very soon. I think about 60% of them were saying it would happen within the next year. And so, we've really seen, just speaking to the strength of the American economy, a decline in economists predicting a recession, because so far it seems that the Fed has engineered that soft landing that you referenced, Nicole.
Right. Which again, I think our whole point is, you got to look at the actual facts. And, the facts come out later. So we have the news cycle, which is kind of filling space because they need to. And I know we'll wrap up with the whole news cycle and things like that, and how it might be impacting the disconnect between what is really going on in the economy and with wages and inflation versus how people feel. And I think too, why don't we, I'm thinking here, just looking at our time, I know you and I could talk all day. There are some, maybe if you want to do I thought there was a nice little recap of when we were prepping for this, of a couple, there's 3 fast facts you had found in your research.
Yeah. Yeah. So, look, we're not trying to convince anyone that the U.S. economy is perfect and everyone's reaping the benefits. There are certainly Americans who are hurting, and there are many who have been left behind. But it's certainly factual to say that we're living through one of the best economic periods of even the past 50 years, based on the data we're seeing. When you think about inflation peaked between 2 and 3 years ago, the unemployment rate has averaged about 3.8% for the past couple of years, when we never saw an unemployment rate that low in the 70s, 80s, or 90s. And real GDP grew by just under 3% over the past 2 years. So, just looking at the raw data, things are looking really good. And that's why it's so shocking as we look to this next section of our conversation.
Right.
Why are so many Americans' views on the economy filled with doom and negativity? And how do we understand that?
Right. And I think I can answer that in one hyphenated word: doom scrolling. But I know you're going to add a few more details around that.
Yeah, sure. Since the early 2000s, we as a country have been stuck on a downward trajectory when it comes to our outlook on the direction of the U.S. which is stark in comparison to how satisfied that we individually feel about our personal financial situations. And so, to highlight that, a recent Gallup poll shows that people in America are 5 times as satisfied with their own life as they are with the direction of the country as a whole. This really isn't a new phenomenon, but it certainly appears to be getting worse in many cases. And just to reference another Gallup poll, as of 2022, 85% of Americans were satisfied with the way things were going in their personal lives, but only 17% of Americans were satisfied with the way things are going in the United States.
I wonder too, Ben, I'm just going to interject. I think I can share my personal feelings, but I feel like with my own finances or, an individual, like you do have more control. I mean, we don't fully control everything, but you do have more control, like to control your spending and the choices you're making. So I wonder if that's factoring in too. I mean, obviously we can all vote, but you really don't have control over the financial decisions that the legislators are making on our behalf. So I wonder, I'm thinking that might factor into a portion of the disconnect.
I'd have to imagine, certainly. That's a great point about, control and or the lack thereof.
Right.
And, really this trend, when you look at personal financial situations, it continues strongly. Just to throw another statistic out there, while 73% of American adults feel good about their personal finances, only 38% feel good about their local economy, and only 18% feel good about the national economy. So to your point, Nicole, as you sort of get further away from control over your finances, Americans' confidence in how things are going decreases. So we felt strongly about our own financial well-being throughout even the challenging pandemic environment. But as you sort of get away from, being able to control your situation, maybe at the local level, you probably have some control, paying taxes, being able to elect a mayor, et cetera. When you get to the national level, it could be that certainly a feeling of a lack of control over the direction of the national economy is playing a role here in terms of our pessimism.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do find it interesting, and this is a broad brush comment, how generally people seem more tuned in, or they're following more news or things like that at the national level versus the local level. And I don't know if that's just because I know you do too. You and I live and work in the city of Chicago. And there's certainly always something going on here, but I'm much more dialed into what's going on in Chicago and Illinois, just because I feel like that's going to have even a bigger impact on myself and my personal finances.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree.
So, all right. Well, why don't we been teasing it a little bit? I know you have a lot of other stats, but why don't we kind of wrap this up with where we've kind of been leading to, which is, and we've alluded to a little bit, is if Americans generally feel good about their personal situation or prospects, why are they, again, generally, feeling so bad when you look at it at the more macro level?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, clearly there are a couple of factors at play here that cause us to view the country as a whole more negatively than our own personal situations. First, some of these sentiments are likely driven by politics. So, per the Pew Research Center, as you'd expect, Republicans are more positive about the economy when a Republican president is in office and more negative when a Democrat is in charge. The same is true for Democrats in reverse order. And so in recent years, Democrats were more positive about the national economy than Republicans. We would expect that trend to flip now that President Trump is back in office. And those political trends extend to personal finances as well, with Democrats being slightly more positive about their financial situation in recent years than Republicans. You would expect that to flip going forward. Though, again, when we look at the personal level, there's a much smaller divergence than when you look at the national level. And we see that even within politics as well. I think another factor at play here could be just human nature. And you referenced this earlier, Nicole. We're more naturally predisposed to view the rest of the world negatively and view ourselves positively. That's just part of human nature. But last but not least, and I think you introed this with your comment about doom scrolling, a huge factor at play here is that the news, sells negativity.
Well, and it never stops, right? I mean,
that's right.
Between the cable TV or TV streaming, right? Oh, I just dated myself. Between however you get your news, right? It is 24/7. And then we can certainly, with our little phones in our hands, whether it's social media or your news feeds and stuff, it's mind-boggling the amount of information that is coming our way constantly.
Mm-hmm. Certainly. And you read stories that or studies that say that we digest more information from the news in a single day than people would have in their entire lifetime just a few short centuries ago. So, we have incredible access to news, but also that news is more likely to be negative than positive. At the end of the day, news organizations, by and large, are trying to turn a profit, and they do that by attracting eyeballs to their content. And sadly, negativity sells. A recent Harvard study looked at more than 370 million stories on the internet to determine how negative language can impact news consumption. And lo and behold, the more negative the headline, the more likely people were to click on the story, regardless of what the story was about. So
that's disheartening.
It certainly is. It certainly is. Yeah. And look, the news companies and social media, they're feeding us what we want based on our habits and our consumption. So, the downside to that is it can cause our outlook on our country and the world to become increasingly negative, even when things by and large are going really well, especially from an economics perspective.
Yeah. So I think the other thing I would add on to that comment you're exactly right. Our social media feeds, anytime you're logging onto anything, they're tracking, and then they look at what you click on, where do you spend the most time, and then they just kind of recreate that same feed. So I would just highly suggest to our listeners that you do try to search out sites that might have, or sources that might have a different point of view from you, just to try to get, more sides of the story, if you will. Because one of the things, and Ben and I won't get into it today, but feeding yourself with negative input or news or things like that, not only does that weigh on you emotionally, but it is going to manifest itself potentially physically. And that's just, in my opinion, not a good way to go through life. So whether you try to just search out the other side to expand, how you're looking at an issue or a situation, or even search out, there are sites, I know I follow a couple on Instagram that are all about good news and like people doing nice things for others and things like that. So I think as we kind of talk about, even with our clients, going all or nothing on anything is probably not a good approach. So try and get a little bit of balance, or at least counterbalance into your day. So I think with that, Ben, is there anything else you wanted to share as we wrap up, or just, if you wanted to highlight one or two key takeaways for our listeners before we wrap up?
Yeah, sure. I think just in summary, a combination of high inflation rates, increasing polarization of politics, and constant negativity from the traditional news media and social media certainly are creating this massive vibe session that we're talking about. And, that's even despite the very encouraging, frankly, economic progress this country has made post-pandemic. We continue to be the richest, most prosperous nation on the planet. And, it's disheartening to see that that certainly isn't being reflected in Americans' views of the economy. So
So I think with that, before we kind of wrap up our episode, as our longtime listeners know, I always ask my guests, and I think it's a great segue. We'll see if Ben's going to eat his own cooking here. If you could live anywhere in the world and you didn't have any constraints, wanting, needing to be near family or money constraints or time, where would you live and why?
That is a great question. I sort of teed it up at the beginning when I think I mentioned, my wife and I, we like to take trips to Wisconsin and hang out up there. I would love to live in Door County. It's one of my favorite places in Wisconsin. I'm sure a lot of people will talk about beaches and, somewhere warm, but
yep.
I just grew up. I have a lot of extended family up in Wisconsin. I attended the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I'm a big Packers fan. So to me, proximity to Lambeau Field as a Packers fan, family up there, loving the North Woods and just the clean air and
it is beautiful up there.
The beauty. Exactly. It's, I think that's where I'd want to live and, hopefully retire one day.
All right. Well, for our listeners, Ben is putting his money where his mouth is and he's doubling down on the U.S. So he's walking the talk, talking the walk.
That's right. That's right. I could have picked China, but I went with Wisconsin. So.
Okay.
Usually, Nicole, I think, God, that's a great place to go to. I should put that on my list of places to retire to. But Ben, I just can't do it. I just can't do it. It is beautiful. I've been up there. I've seen it, and it is gorgeous. But I am just not built for this much cold. I mean, I get it. Back when I was a television reporter, I did a stand-up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin in May in the middle of snow flurries. Okay.
Wow.
That was like, I thought, I can't do this. I just can't do this anymore.
Wow.
So, but somebody has to live there and milk those cows and make the cheese. So God bless you.
That's right. And somebody has to eat the chease. So,
well, I'm there for eating the cheese part.
I'm me too. Happy to help you out from that front.
Amen. And regarding eggs, I got green with envy that you paid $6 a dozen for fresh eggs.
I know, I shouldn't say anything because I'm like, how is this happening? This is amazing.
That is incredible. That is so great. I'm surrounded, and I have to say, where I live in New Jersey, I'm surrounded by a lot of local farmers, and they do, you can't get fresh eggs, but they are well above $6 a dozen at this point. So I'm jealous. I am jealous. So Nicole, anybody that's listening to this podcast who is intrigued by this conversation or maybe wants to have further talks about this, what's the best way for them to get a hold of you all?
Yeah, so the best way is to go to our website at myprivatevista.com. And on our homepage, there's a contact us button. You can complete your information, reference this episode, and then we can certainly have Ben or myself reach out to you. If you prefer to call, you can call our main line at 312-831-4370 and ask to be connected with Ben or myself. And we're happy to have a conversation.
Excellent. And if you're listening to the podcast, if you don't already have a relationship with My Private Vista and with Nicole, she is everything you hear on the podcast, and I mean that in the best, most positive way possible. The other thing I would suggest that you do is if you are not a subscriber to this podcast, that part is really easy. You don't have to pick up a phone or do anything except push the follow button. You're a subscriber. And every time Nicole drops a new episode of the podcast, you're notified. You can give it a listen. And if you like this podcast, please share it with folks. Let them know about it. Word of mouth promotion is very effective, and we would very much appreciate it. So until next time, on behalf of Nicole and everybody at My Private Vista, I'm Bill Tucker, thanking you for tuning in today and reminding you that you can go out today and doom scroll or not. Until next time.
Thank you for listening to the Dollars and Cents Creating Your Fulfilled Life with Nicole Romito, sponsored by Private Vista. Visit our website at www.myprivatevista.com or give us a call at 312-831-4370. And don't forget to click the follow button to be notified when new episodes become available. Private Vista is a group comprised of investment professionals registered with Hightower Advisors, LLC, an SEC-registered investment advisor. Advisory services are offered through Hightower Advisors, LLC. This is not an offer to buy or sell securities. No investment process is free of risk, and there is no guarantee that the investment process or the investment opportunities referenced herein will be profitable. Past performance is neither indicative nor a guarantee of future results. The investment opportunities referenced herein may not be suitable for all investors. All data or other information referenced herein is from sources believed to be reliable. Any opinions, news, research, analyses, prices, or other data or information contained in this presentation is provided as general market commentary and does not constitute investment advice. Private Vista and Hightower Advisors, LLC, or any of its affiliates make no representations or warranties expressed or implied as to the accuracy or completeness of the information or for statements or errors or omissions, or results obtained from the use of this information. Private Vista and Hightower Advisors, LLC assume no liability for action made or taken in reliance on or relating in any way to this information. The information is provided as of the date referenced. Such data and other information are subject to changes without notice. This was created for informational purposes only. The opinions expressed herein are solely those of the authors and do not represent those of Hightower Advisors, LLC, or any of its affiliates.